In this video, we're going to be talking about 19.2 population growth and regulation and 19.3 the human population. So when you're talking about how populations grow, there's lots of ways that you can measure that, but we're going to be specifically looking at these two types of growth, exponential growth and logistic growth. So in exponential growth, this is a model where resources tend to be somewhat unlimited for the organism. And in logistic growth, this is a model where the environment only has a certain amount of resources available to the organism, and so the organism has a point where it tops out. So looking at the exponential growth curve first. In this model, because resources tend to be unlimited for the organism will actually nearly double its population size or close to it every so many generations, to the point that the growth curve tends to start going nearly straight up, and tends to seem like there's no end in sight to how much this population will grow or what the top number will eventually be. In logistic growth, the organism's populations tend to grow, but at kind of a slower pace, and then they get to a point where they're maybe growing very quickly or doubling, but they reach a point where the environment just doesn't have any more resources to help any more of their population, and so they tend to top off. Examples of where the environment doesn't have enough resources to carry anymore would be, the not having enough food or water or places to live or places to burrow and hide and nest, etc. And so if the population does creep above this carrying capacity of what the environment can support, it'll quickly actually dip down again, because that means that the population got a little too big for the environment and some will die. So this is really looked at as the maximum number of a certain species the ecosystem can support without losing its balance. Interestingly, the human population has been tending to grow like this in an exponential way. However, the global birth rates for humans has been declining since the 1980s. So we will be talking about that later. So moving down here to density dependent and density independent regulation. So density dependent regulation is a type of regulation like keeping a population in check depending on how many organisms are there. So these types of factors are ones that the more individuals there are of a certain type of species or animal, the more they're going to be hurt by this regulation. And if there's not very many of them, they won't be that hurt. So some of the things that tend to regulate populations are inter and intra-specific competition. That means that species are competing either of the same species for food or different species for the same food source, or there's predation, or you can have parasites, and the more individuals there are, the more they're going to be hurt by the parasites, again because they're like closer together. So a density dependent limiting factor is one that is dependent on the density. And so I want to show you this picture of the lynx and the hare. This was a good example that came to mind. Here in this diagram that's often used, this chart, you'll see that the hare population, which is this blue line, and then the lynx, which is like, the hare is like a rabbit and the lynx is like a cat that eats the rabbits. As the hare population increases, the number of lynx will eventually increase too, because there's a lot more food out there. So that means later on there can be more hares born and survive. But then as the hares start to drop off, then it takes a little while, but the lynx population will start to starve out and die as well. And so this happens over and over again, where you'll see that as one population, the prey population, increases, the predator population will lag behind it and also increase. But then as the prey population decreases, it'll take a little bit of time for the lynx to starve out, and then they will also decline. A density independent factor is one that will come and wipe out populations regardless of how many are there. So, for instance, a drought. A drought doesn't care if there's a lot of a certain kind of animal plant in the area. It's a drought, it's a weather condition. Or you'll have something like a volcano. The volcano will come and wipe out a large number of organisms, and they don't care how many there are. The volcano is going to erupt either way. This can be other weather things like tsunamis or storms. And so these are regulating factors that it doesn't matter how many of a certain individuals there are, they are going to come and wipe it out either way. So the last thing in this section that I want to talk to you about is R species versus K species. So R species are ones that have a lot of babies. They have a lot of young, and they're hoping that just a few of them or some of them will survive. And then there's the K selected species where they don't tend to have too many young, but it's expected that the large majority of their population will actually survive to at least reproduction age. So we are going to move on now to the human population and how this applies to us. So as already mentioned, the human population has, it grew really slowly until about in the 1800s. And in the 1800s, we hit 1 billion people for the first time that's known on our planet. But then, shortly thereafter, about 130 years later, we hit 2 billion people. So it took, you know, hundreds of years to get, you know, are thousands, except I don't know that it was recorded for sure before then, but just on this recorded time period, it took hundreds and hundreds of years for us to reach our first million, but then only 130 years to reach the second million. And then from there, it's really been exponential ever since. It's gone very quickly. So there's this interesting chart here that shows that to reach the first billion people took hundreds of years. But then to reach the second billion people only took 130 years. To reach the third billion people, which we did in 1960, so from 1930 to 1960, which was 30 years, it only took 30 years to gain another billion, and then 15 years to gain the next billion, and then 12. But then here we started to slow our curve a little bit, where then it started taking 13 years and 16 years, and they predict in the future about 26 years before we get another billion. And that's because generally families are a little bit smaller now, and people are not on that exponential curve that they were before. But it is interesting to note that in the next several years, we are going to have 1 billion more people than what we have now. And it's interesting to think about, because if you thought the roads and schools and stores, whatever, were crowded now, just picture, you know, just a few years from now, in, you know, 1928, for example, there's 1 billion more people than there are now. That's kind of crazy to think about. So the average human growth rate has the rate. So while our numbers are going up, the rate at which we're going up is going down, and that has started to decline in about the 1980s. So these age structure maps will show you about how many of individuals are of a certain age in a population. So I wanted to show you these ones because I like this better than what you guys had in your text. So this is the age structure graph for Ethiopia. And this shows us this on this side there's males and on this side there's females. It shows us percentage of the population, about 8% These read a little weird, but about 8% of the population, the total population of Ethiopia, about 8% is 0 to 4 year old males. And about just a little bit less than that, because that was a little more than 8%, just about 8% are also females. And then, so that's 16%. 16% of their total population are 0 to 4 years old. So very young population. It represents a very large, percentage of how many people they have there. 5 to 9 year old males are about 7%, and also for the females, about 7%. So about 14% of their population are 5 to 9 year olds. As you move up, say you're looking at the 20-year-olds. The 20-year-olds are about 4.5% male and about 4.5% female. You go up a lot further, and now you only have, a very small percent, maybe 0.5% are 75-year-old males, and about, 1% or so are 75-year-old females. So also interesting on this graph, you see that even though there's more males born in Ethiopia right here, the females are tending to live longer. So you can see at the top of this that there's more females alive. This starts to get larger in comparison to this size, even though they start out with more males. Here's Japan. Japan has a great deal of older people alive, more females than males, but they've kept their numbers fairly steady over the years. So you see that people are generally in this model having less children. There's not very many children, and you've got to think about what makes that difficult. But economically, the working population, which is about here, or about this level here, about the middle, this middle of the working population is really paying into a lot of the medical health care and paying into a lot of the types of pension plans and things like that, with the older people collecting, but there's not very many people paying into those things. So that makes it harder for this group to have to support when they're supporting a lot of older people. It's hard for them to support a lot of younger people. So that makes a lot of the families opt to not have children or have very small families. And it's making this kind of almost like a reverse triangle. So it's interesting to watch how that goes. So New Zealand has actually a very stable population where the birth rate tends to match the death rate. But then again, you also see here, interestingly, that the females are really outliving the males in all of these populations. So it's something interesting to think about. Okay, so then when you look at this map, so this map shows the percent growth rate of a population in different countries. So you see here in a lot of North America, and that's not including, Mexico, Guatemala, Honduras, those types of countries, but above Mexico here, we actually are seeing about a 0 to 1% growth rate, and just below us, with countries like Guatemala, Mexico, we're seeing about a 1% growth rate. So while the United States and Canada is like 0 to 1% growth rate, they're about a 1% growth rate. And then there's some Central American countries that are about a 2% growth rate. A lot of South America, at the top of South America, they're about a 1% growth rate, and most of it in very far South America, by like Chile, you're looking at a 0 to 1%. So the highest birth rate or growth percentage is actually these colors here, which are tend to be in Africa and tend to be, in some parts of Asia over here. But you don't see that as much right now in the Americas, and all of these change. Interestingly, there's actually some that are this kind of burgundy color here that are like Greenland, Russia. Here in these countries, you're actually seeing a negative percent in growth rate, meaning people are opting not to have very many children and the population is actually declining. So, what are the different consequences with this? Well, we already kind of talked about one of the consequences of declining the population is that it does put more stress on the younger people to take care of a wide range of older people that are retired or aging and need a lot of care. But the reverse triangle, where you're having a lot of children, um, with few adults supporting them, can lead to situations where you have, not enough food or not enough resources like healthcare, or it can just cause you to use every resource that you see, which causes a lot of environmental damage. So, all of these have different pros and cons that need to be looked at and considered. But generally speaking, um, most resources that exist on our earth, there's a lot of room for improvement in how we use our resources and making sure that we use our resources really wisely. So each of these models has different pros and cons that could be debated and talked about, but that's the exponential human growth situation that we are facing.